What's the difference between a hippo and a zippo? One is really heavy, and the other is a little lighter. What's the difference between an alligator and a crocodile? You will see one later and the other after a while. Differences. There are differences all over the Bible, contrasts and differences. And so whenever I see a difference, we want to notice that, we want to mark it, because it is going to be important to recognize that as we interpret the text later on. So let me show you what this looks like when I annotate the Bible. This is from Psalm 4. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to skip to verse 3. It says, "But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Be angry, but sin not. Commune with your own hearts on your beds and be silent." So anytime that I see a contrast like we have in verse 4, be angry, but sin not, I am going to highlight that red. And by the way, in my in an annotation system, when I see a similarity, I highlight that green. So be angry, but sin not. All right. So that is something that later on, when you look at this psalm, it's going to be a reminder to you, especially as you go from observation, be angry, but sin not is a contrast, to interpretation. And when you talk especially about like the moral choices about what we're supposed to do, be angry but sin not is something that you would interpret about how you live your life, about the way you live your life. And as you apply the text to your life, that would be something to keep in mind. Hi, my name is Kenny Griswold, and this is the Hidden Treasure Bible YouTube channel, where I teach people, especially Catholics, how to study the Bible. I have a whole annotation system, and you can see it here on the screen. One of the things that I want you to just notice is that there are 7 different colors here, and I use highlighters for all of these colors. And if you're wondering, where do you get highlighters that come in these 7 colors, if you just look on Amazon, there's these really great Mr. Pen highlighters. They're called chisel tip highlighters, and they are great. You can get a set of 4, like full sets, so 28 highlighters for like $8 on Amazon. So I really recommend you do that and you start using them. So let's look at a few other differences and contrasts that we see in the Bible. Okay, this is from Proverbs 3. It's probably one of the most famous of the Proverbs, maybe the most famous of the Proverbs. It's found in verse 5. Okay, so I'll start at verse 4. It says, "So you will find favor and good repute in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own insight." Now, a lot of times when you see contrasts and differences, it's going to be marked off with the word, the conjunction "but." But sometimes it's not "but," sometimes it's the word "and." So we see that here. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own insight. Those two things are being opposed to one another. And again, you would use that as you interpret the text, and especially as you apply the text to your life. You would want to look at that and apply that and think about, what is it that I'm looking at from God's perspective, trusting in the Lord, and what is it that I'm looking at it from my own perspective and just doing it because that's what I see as being the best without looking at God. Now let's look at another example. This is from Genesis 29, which is the story of the marriage of Jacob to the sisters Rachel and Leah. And he wants to marry Rachel. He doesn't want to marry Leah. And I want to just read off a few things and make a few points about this as we go through. Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful and lovely. So right there, we have a difference between Rachel and Leah. Okay, their eyes, Rachel is beautiful and lovely. And it says, Jacob loved Rachel. Now, one thing that maybe people wouldn't think of using a contrast and a difference highlight, an annotation for, would be when there's some kind of a preference, when there's some kind of like a better or worse, faster, slower, stronger, weaker, anything like that, where you're comparing or contrasting. Really, you're contrasting how something is done or qualities about a person or something like that. You want to show with a contrast. And so this right here says that Jacob loved Rachel. Now you're going to want to notice that, that's a desire that he has, which could be important talking about Jacob himself, but also just to notice that Rachel is the one that's preferred. She's more beautiful. She's more lovely. And so she is the one that Jacob wants to marry. Okay. And as you go through the story, it talks about him serving Laban, the father, for 7 years. And then on the wedding night, Laban changes so that it's not Rachel in the wedding bed, but it's actually Leah there. And so Jacob has married Leah. He's kind of stuck with her now, and he ends up marrying Rachel as well. And one thing I want to point out about this. Here's what it says in verse 25. It says, "In the morning, behold, it was Leah, and Jacob said to Laban, 'What is this that you have done to me?'" So he's angry at him. He's frustrated with him. One thing I want to point out when you're using these differences, when you're highlighting red, is that there's a difference between differences, contrasts, and differences, right? We call that conflict. When there's any kind of opposition or anger or frustration, anything that pits people against each other, we're going to have a different annotation for that. Now, it's similar to differences. And so what you're going to do is you are going to highlight it red, just like you would for any kind of difference that was kind of neutral in tone or emotion. But to show that it's a conflict and not just a difference, you're also going to underline it. Okay, I have that there because sometimes when you read, you might think that something is just a contrast, and then as you read further, you realize that it's actually a conflict. And so just to be aware of that there's different kind of differences. There's differences, and then there are differences. Okay, so you want to notice these differences. They can be important in the text, and that's it. All right. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, send me an email. Check in the notes below. Like always, please like, subscribe, share with other people. We're trying to get people to have a Bible study revolution in the Catholic Church, and this is where it can begin. Have a great day, everyone.